So we, the Jewish people, find ourselves in the middle of a festival called in Hebrew Sukkot. In English, it's called, the word might be translated as booths, Booths, or Tabernacles. So you'll hear of the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles. Eastern Europeans, and it says Ashkenazi spelling, call it Sukkot. So if you hear the word Sukkot, it's Sukkot. It's in the 5 books of Moses, and a commanded holiday that begins on the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei. Now, the first day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah. Very quickly, the Jewish calendar has 12 months that alternate in 29 and 30 days. Because it is a lunar calendar, the last day and the first day of each month are on the new moon. And the 15th day of each month is the full moon. So every year on this, the full moon, and the festival began last Tuesday evening, on the full moon closest to the autumnal equinox, that day around September 21st or 22nd, when there's an equal number of hours of day and night. This is when the festival of Sukkot begins, and it's been established that way for some 3,000 years. In fact, we believe that the festival of Sukkot precedes the creation of Judaism. It's even older than Judaism. Here in the lower right, you see a typical booth, a very temporary dwelling. We'll get to that. In the 5 books of Moses, that's 5 books of Moses, is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they are called, in Hebrew, the Torah, and the name used for the festival of Sukkot is also Chag HaAsif, a festival of ingathering, and so it's a time of gathering together our crops, our harvest festival, and as Chag HaSukkot, the festival of booths. So in these names, we find the double significance of Sukkot. The first is that it is a harvest festival, as we see from the 34th chapter of the book of Exodus. It's an ingathering of the fruits of the summer season. Sukkot is celebrated year-round, but in the land that today is the land of Israel, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, interestingly, it heralds the beginning of a rainy season. The rainy season will last 6 months. 6 months from this festival of Sukkot that we're celebrating today, we will celebrate Pesach, Passover, the spring harvest festival. In Israel, the rainy season lasts those 6 months. It's from the time of Passover, perhaps in late March, early April, or mid-April, from Passover to Sukkot. Over the summer, it's a great 6 months to plan a picnic, because the chances of rain are virtually zero. Before the advent of those window washers that we have on our cars, Israelis and people throughout the Middle East, in that area in the Middle East, would take off their windshield wipers and throw them in the trunk because they had no use, and the brutal sun would only cause them to crack. And so that, knowing the dry season and the wet season, actually in the land of Israel, rain begins now, and the landscape begins to green up, and flowers literally come out from the sand in the desert, and it's a renewal of life, the life of nature. But in Leviticus chapter 23, we find that it's not thought of as a harvest festival, but rather a festival in which we remember that we wandered in the desert for 40 years between Egypt and entering the land of Canaan, the promised land. And during that time, we lived in temporary booths called the Sukkah. And we are to build a Sukkah and live in a Sukkah even today at this season, to remember that God is the God who brought us up from the land of Egypt, who brought us from slavery and dependency to freedom and sovereignty, so that we could stand on our very own. So the question arises, since it's a Thanksgiving harvest festival, there happens to be plenty of evidence that the Mayflower Pilgrims, who came to Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts, were very familiar with the Bible. And by the way, as we'll see, they were very familiar with the Bible in its original Hebrew. Hebrew was central to Protestantism of the Low Countries and of England at that time. By the way, if you go look at the insignia of Yale or the insignia of the Yale University or the insignia of Dartmouth, you'll see Hebrew words in the insignia. Hebrew, they didn't all know Hebrew, but certainly the clergy learned Hebrew. Harvard was the first seminary in this country, in what would become this country, and Hebrew was essential. There was a Hebrew language teacher who was actually born a Jew, but he couldn't teach at Harvard if he was Jewish, and so he had to convert. The earliest pilgrims saw themselves, in fact, as new Israelites, and this land, the United States, Massachusetts certainly, was the new Israel. And we have evidence in diaries that William Bradford, who you see his dates there, wrote in Hebrew in his own diary. Obviously, there's no photograph of William, and he never sat for a portrait. This is a guess. Now, my slides are a little bit out of order, so you're going to have to excuse me. A future governor of what became the Massachusetts Bay Colony, so this is a little further north of Plymouth Rock, in what's to be Boston, was John Winthrop. And he was the governor of this second major colony in New England. And as the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and you see part of its extent here, but actually it went all the way to the Great Lakes, in the map at the lower right. He said, "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us." They really saw themselves as the new Jews, new Israel. "When 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies." That's a quote, that a takeoff from a statement in the 40th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. When he, and it probably should be a capital H referring to God, "shall make us praise the glory that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it likely that of New England." That God was there, and the Hebrew Bible was central to Winthrop. We know that he, too, wrote in Hebrew. One of the features of a sukkah is, again, its portability, its flimsiness, its lack of permanence, and the fact that the roof is covered with what's called in Hebrew schach. That ch, so it's got twice the ch sound. That does not really appear in English, but some of you know the German word Achtung, attention. So think of it as the ch guttural sound. So this wall structure has schach on top of it. I came to this was a little bit late for me. The news cycle did not quite work with my presentation of the slides, but if you close your eyes and imagine the people under and around the Del Rio Bridge, crossing the Rio Grande River, they created Sukkot as well. And many of them took branches and vegetation, threw them on the roofs of the flimsy structures that they were able to make to protect them from the intense sun. And thank goodness someone is beginning to recognize the promise of the Statue of Liberty of welcoming people, and that they will move, as the children of Israel did, from these temporary dwellings to something more permanent and more protective. So a sukkah has to be temporary. It can't even be attached to a house or to a permanent tree. It has to be freestanding. Has to be something that can be moved as if you were wandering around the desert for 40 years. It's a fragile dwelling. Okay. It's, again, nothing permanent. These are not really Sukkot, but this picture gives you an idea that people everywhere need that protection from the sun. We'll put up something temporary here to have a picnic, or I'm not sure if this is a group of refugees or not, but you can imagine it. They need something temporary. And they too, we hope, even the people coming across the Rio Grande, are moving from this state of enslavement and uncertainty to a promised land that will provide them with permanence and safety and some place where they can dwell securely. It's something we all desire. But at the same time, we recognize that we all live in fragile dwellings. And here's also where the news happens to have become very important. Sadly, everyone in the Champlain Towers and South Condos in Sunrise, Florida, and in similar situations, perhaps even throughout the country and throughout the world, think that we live in permanent structures. But the fact of the matter is, like the sukkah, like the booth of old, that we as Jews still create and still live in for 8 days, even in 2021, our dwellings are not permanent, but rather temporary as well. Here's someone who thought they had a permanent dwelling on Volano Beach, just north of St. Augustine, and it was not to be the case. Here's somebody who on the New Jersey shore thought that they had a permanent dwelling. None of us have permanent dwellings, and we have to recognize that these things are transient, but at the same time, that God will protect us. For in the biblical book of Amos, we see a promise made by God through Amos to the people of Israel, that there will come a day when I, God, will raise up the tabernacle of David that has fallen, close up the breaches thereof, and I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as of days of old. And so what is the tabernacle of David? Now, those of you who know something about biblical history know that it wasn't David, but rather his son Solomon, who built the first temple that stood in Jerusalem. And so Amos is talking not about a physical tabernacle or booth, but rather a spiritual one, an umbrella over us, a feeling of safety and security that, and this is a feature of Judaism, that we don't concern ourselves so much with things that have length and width and height that we can see, feel, and touch. This is a tabernacle, again, of safety that has no length, width, or height, security has no length, width, or height, in which we can feel safe, and we can dwell under our fig trees and vines, and none will make us afraid. And so at this time, we remember God's providence in protecting us as well. That Solomon's temple is also thought in a way to be a sukkah. Nothing is really permanent. Here's a depiction of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. If you should go to Jerusalem, you'll not find this, but you'll find something that looks like this. This is on the lower right is the western wall. The gold dome is called the Dome of the Rock. By the way, the much discussed Al-Aqsa Mosque is off to the right. Where those trees are and where the Dome of the Rock is the Haram al-Sharif, the holy place to Muslims that Israel happens to have ceded to the Waqif. The Muslim authorities are in charge, and in fact, Jews are not. This is changing, but Jews are not even permitted to go there and to pray, not because Jews don't want to, but because the Muslim authorities. So, but all of this reminds us that God's presence is not physical, but something we can't see, feel, or touch, something spiritual, something perhaps psychological, sociological. It's that divine protection that is much more important than any one of our dwellings. It is, in the end, only temporary. Few of the houses we live in today will last for another 100 years or 150 years. It's unlikely that they'll last 200 years. Only those special places and historical places do these houses live as much as we can. So let me introduce you for a moment, and I wanted not to reveal who John Chapman was so that we could relate to him as a human being, because we really ought to relate to him. What's important about John Chapman is that today is his birthday. Some 26, 46, what is it, 247th birthday. He was born, I don't know if anybody here is from Massachusetts. I think Leominster is north and west of Boston, and died in Indiana. That's also important as well. Now you'll have to excuse me again. I was quite surprised to open my presentation this morning and find out that my slides were not quite in order. Okay, here we are. So here's the depiction of John Chapman. He became an American legend, but he was just, and the reason I didn't want to reveal who he really was so that we could relate to him. He was just an American. He became legendary towards the end of his life, but he was kind, he was generous, and he expressed his leadership in the conservation of nature. That was first and foremost to him. And since it's his birthday, we should on this day, and I ask you to join me on this day in celebrating conservation of nature. There are various legends and stories about John Chapman. He was lying by his campfire once. He wandered around what today we would have, or what would be called the Northwest Territories. He Ohio, Indiana, western Pennsylvania, perhaps northern Kentucky, and westward into Illinois. So he was sitting at his fire and noticed mosquitoes were attracted to the blaze and burn. He was so concerned that he took the tin utensil. Now, he was known to have a pot on his head. Yeah, we would regard him as a nutcase or a fruitcake, and that maybe he should be institutionalized. But it was his cap and his mush pot. He ate out of it. He filled it with water, quenched the fire, and said, "God forbid that I should build a fire for my comfort that should be the means of destroying even mosquitoes." So back 200 years ago, John Chapman understood the ecological impact of even insects, that other insects feed on those insects, or birds, and so and the chain in which we are all connected. Another time, he had a campfire in a snowstorm. He got into a hollow log. He intended to pass the night, but he found it was occupied by a bear and cubs. So he removed his fire to the other end and slept in the snow in the open air rather than to disturb the bear. He recognized that the territory, the land in which he went, belonged to the bears long before it belonged to human beings. Today, of course, we're busy fencing out bears and trying to keep them off our highways so they don't get killed. But we need to, of course, always bear in mind on this day, John Chapman's birthday, that the bears were here first, and we're squatters on their land. He once had a pet wolf. It said that he helped heal his injured leg, and the wolf became his pet. He had heard that a horse was to be put down, so he bought the horse, bought a few grassy acres nearby. We should all emulate this, or there are organizations like this to which we should donate and support and give our time. And he turned it out to recover, and then gave the horse to someone needy, exacting a promise to treat it humanely. That the humane treatment of animals was a primary concern to John Chapman. During his later life, he became a vegetarian, like many of us, not wanting to kill an animal. As I speak of this to my grandchildren, I say, how would you feel if an animal ate you? Well, how do we feel if we eat an animal? He never married, and he thought a soulmate would appear to him in heaven, if not on earth. And so there's a museum commemorating John Chapman in Urbana, Ohio, north and west of Columbus, in the center of the state. If you're ever in the area, I urge you to visit it. It commemorates his dedication to conservation, and I ask that on this day, his birthday, we too rededicate ourselves to the principles for which John Chapman stood, because they're so in harmony and so in sync with this festival of Sukkot, this fall harvest festival, in which we create these booths. I didn't mention that the booths are created even to this very day in people's backyards, and to the greatest extent possible. We spend as much time in the sukkah. Many people sleep in the sukkah, take our meals in the sukkah. Some will bring a television or a laptop or something and watch entertainment, work in the sukkah, just to remember, not to take for granted the permanence, some semi-permanence of our homes, but that we should be out in nature. In that way, the sukkah, this booth, has a connection with a Christmas tree. A Christmas tree, you'll note, is our grasping onto nature, the same with Christmas wreaths. We grasp and hold on to nature at the darkest time of the year. Notice it's at the winter solstice, when the greatest number of darkness hours prevail over just a few hours of light. And with the Christmas tree, what we're really doing is grabbing onto nature. A few people who have Christmas trees understand this any longer. We're holding onto nature as best we can, as it seems to be disappearing, only to return as the days get longer through early January into February and March. And so with the Sukkah, we too are holding on to nature. We spend too much time, all of us, separating ourselves from nature, when we have to realize that it envelops us and it protects us and it is actually our friend. There's more and more written, and I heard the comment about the air conditioning in the church, the deleterious effect of air conditioning in so many ways. It uses so much power, electricity. Somehow people survived in Florida, not many, but somehow people survived in Florida without air conditioning. Air conditioning is being recognized as a major destroyer of the natural world around us. Here's that John Chapman Museum in Urbana, Ohio. And there's a monument to John Chapman. And I was to ask at this time, the notice that went out undercut this effort, how many of you had heard the name John or Jonathan Chapman? And how many of you knew who he was and who he is? Because we better know him as, here's a historical marker, not fun, Johnny Appleseed. No one knows his name is Chapman. But as you see, he was an actual person and became a folk hero. He lived along French Creek. Okay? He was, and note, he didn't just walk around picking up apple cores, taking out the seeds and plant them, but he was a nurseryman, and he raised trees and would dig up the trees and sell them where he needed, or encourage people just to take them and to plant them on their properties. So on this day, there's still a lot of time left in this day, I'm going to urge you to find a tree. By the way, one of my favorites is go get an avocado at the grocery store. Take out the seed. If you're not sure how to put toothpicks in it and put it in a shot glass or a low glass of water and watch the roots form, you can find that online. I like to do it with mango seeds as well. But take the seeds of any, happen to have tomatoes growing outside, that didn't buy any seeds, just sliced the tomato and put the tomato on the dirt, and up came the plants. But take the seeds, and I have done it with citrus as well. We'll never get any edible fruit from it, but take the seeds, plant something today, and encourage people to plant. All around us, building is expanding, interest rates are low, developers are cutting down trees and clearing property. Let's, even if only symbolically, gather together, join together, and decide that rather than tearing things down tearing apart nature. We're going to add to it. We're going to grow something. And so Johnny Appleseed Day is September the 26th. And Sukkot, of course, is that harvest festival. As fruit ripens, do me a favor as well. Go to the store, savor a deliciously sweet apple. What we have today is very hybridized and genetically modified and all that kind of stuff, and gassed and so on. And that's why it would be great if you could grow your own apples. But consider also visiting a landmark near you or a nature preserve or anything. And you can Google Johnny Appleseed Day and find out about all the activities that are taking place here on Johnny Appleseed Day. So I ask you to join me again, and let's not subtract from nature. Let's dedicate this day, Johnny Appleseed's birthday, Johnny Appleseed Day, here in the middle of this festival of Sukkot, where we go out into nature and celebrate the harvest and celebrate God's beneficence through giving us the fruit of the earth. And join with me today to celebrate that and to take some positive action to grow something to add to the world of nature. And that way, divine protection will come upon each and every one of us, and we together will make the world a better place. I thank you, and if anyone has any questions, I don't know what the order is, you can ask them now or ask them later, or raise any problems, topics, or issues of your concern. But again, I hope you'll join me in making the world a better place. Thank you again for this opportunity.